Hey readers, last time we read, we left Will in the fight in a bit of a cliffhanger. Remember, he was thinking how this fight might lead to unconsciousness or hospitalization or even reconstructive surgery. That last line had me a little bit worried about Will. But since we began the story, we've been investigating how the setting, how the mood or the atmosphere or the psychology that's shifting might influence the character's behaviors. We came to realize that perhaps Will agrees to this fight because in this school he can't imagine not agreeing. It's like his choices are limited by the place he finds himself in. Here's some things we jotted down about this story so far. All right, so far we've decided that, this place is nasty, it's mean, a lot of people are fake. This place is a place that is tough. You have to be tough here. We've talked about how Will's different on the inside and the outside. On the inside, he's terrified. On the outside, he acts tough. And then we've also seen how from the 4th grade to the 8th grade, this setting has changed. 4th grade, we've got, at the end of 4th grade, after he gained some popularity, we've got baseball games and bicycle races and sleepovers. And then in the 8th grade, we've got pointing fingers, looking threatening, glares, setting up a fight. So, we're going to start by reading a chunk of the final part of the story. As I read, we do the intellectual work that the story seems to be asking you to do. That is, will you think independently and write some notes on your Post-its or in your notebook or on a piece of paper, and do some of this analytical work that we've learned how to do so far? I want you to keep an eye on our anchor charts. In our anchor charts, we have thought about characters. This is our thinking deeply about characters, and that's always important. But also, I want you to work with the setting, look at the ways that the setting influences the characters. Okay. So while I'm reading, I want you to be jotting down notes and practice some of the work that we have learned so far. Let me go back. I'm gonna go from where Will says, I knew that it would not be a 1 or 2 punch fight. No, it'll be a fight to some extreme and horrifying limit, a fight to unconsciousness or hospitalization or reconstructive surgery. During my walks from class to class, I discovered that most of the 8th grade had taken sides, and that my side consisted of me, a foreign exchange student named Hans, and 2 girls whose hearts I had not yet broken. The rest of my peers were massed behind Mike, eager to see me put in my place once and for all. The last class of the day was shop. We were all told by our teacher, Mr. Bledsoe, to work on our special projects. My special project was a skateboard, so I began sanding the nose and trying with all my might not to think about the fight. It is said that there's nothing like working with wood to take one's mind off of a problem. But it could also be said that there's nothing like a problem to take one's mind off of working with wood. No matter how intensely I sanded the nose of my skateboard, the fight was always with me, and the air around me seemed as thin as the alpine or Himalayan air. I tried to tell myself that in 3 hours it would all be over, that I would be in my own house, in my own room, and the fight would be a memory. But 3 hours would not be enough if I lost the fight. A month would not be enough to heal my humiliation. What would be enough? I asked myself. 6 months? No. A year? Yes, a year would be enough. In a year, I'd be able to look back on this day and smile, or perhaps laugh. In a year, the fight would be a distant memory, and I would be a different person with different friends and new reasons to feel confident and proud. So I closed my eyes and asked God to please make it a year later, to please take me out of this year and place me in the next. With my eyes closed, I almost believed that the time was racing past me, and the eggs were being laid, and chicks were being hatched, growing plump, laying their own eggs and dying. Unfortunately, when I opened my eyes, I knew that I was still 13, still in shop class, and that the fight was waiting to be fought. I thanked God anyway, guessing I had prayed the wrong prayer, looked at the clock, and saw that I had 10 minutes left. I did not even try to sand my skateboard those last 10 minutes. Instead, I drifted into a pleasant state of suspended animation, where there was no joy, no fear, no pride, no regret. During this time, my pulse rate and respiration dropped, the blood in my veins slowed to a crawl, and I believed I stopped aging. And then the bell rang, and my time was up. All right. So far, we've gotten a lot of information about how complex Will is. We can see how he's trapped, and he feels he's unable to put a stop to this fight, even though he doesn't want it. He seems to have a lot of pressure on him to be tough. As I was reading, I think one thought that you might have had was about what kind of place this is and how it affects Will. This school seems like the kind of place where lots of kids act tough, not just Will. After all, it's not like Mike says, oh, no big deal, and then they can just go off and be friends from there. Places can affect characters, and that's what we've been talking about, how the influence that the setting has on the characters. Today, I want to alert you to the notion that the reverse is true also. Characters can also affect places. They especially affect the mood or psychology of a place. When they act like a group, this is called group psychology. So I'm going to reread in this part that I'm just going to reread a couple of places. And I want you to listen to what I reread with the lens of group psychology. Okay, see if you hear what I hear. The part stuck out to me that made me think about how the group psychology can affect can affect Will, our main character. During my walks from class to class, I discovered that most of the 8th grade had taken sides, and that my side consisted of me, a foreign exchange student named Hans, and 2 girls whose hearts I had not yet broken. The rest of my peers were massed behind Mike, eager to see me put in my place once and for all. Okay. Most of the 8th grade had taken sides. Then it says the rest of my peers were massed behind Mike. Okay. So whenever characters begin to think and act alike, like most of his peers seem to be on the other side, not on his side, I want you to think about the group dynamics and what happens. So when people gather together as a group, it can be a force for the good, for great good, or it could also be a force for great bad or evil in books or even in the world. So like readers are alert to the influence of the group dynamics in a place, and the effect that it can have on the individual characters. So as we read on, I want you to be extra alert for the influence of group dynamics. You might be able to see something else as well. The power of the group versus the power of the individual. Be alert to some tension as well. I want you to have your Post-its or notebook out and ready so you can jot thoughts or phrases that seem significant. And I'm going to actually show you something that that could be helpful whenever you're thinking about group versus the individual. And this could be something that you use. So you could have a T-chart and you could note the group dynamics versus the individual. Okay. All right. So while I'm reading, think about group versus the individual. Okay. We were to meet at the front of the school. When I got there, I saw a crowd of 50 or 60 people awaiting my arrival. Under different circumstances, I would have been pleased by the turnout, but the hopelessness of my position offset whatever theatrical lift I might have felt. I did, however, smile. I was, after all, the other half of the act and was not about to look somber or scared or penitent for anyone. I saw Mike Mike Doctor standing 15 or 20 feet away, looking as menacing as ever. He fixed his eyes on me for a moment, then kissed his girlfriend, Linda, leaving. I'd foolishly broken up with Linda 10 months before. Now, as Mike was kissing her, she looked at me as though she would soon have her revenge. And then, before I knew it, someone said, "Let's go," and everyone started walking toward the park 2 blocks away. Strangely, I felt not like a boy on his way to a fight, but like a king on his way to the gallows. These were not my classmates before me, but peasants in revolt. My wife had already been beheaded, my children sold for horses, my servants set free. I tried to put everything in perspective, to assure myself that it was only a fight and that losing was no disgrace. And maybe I wouldn't lose. Maybe I was one of those people who did not know his own strength until he was confronted. Maybe when I was facing Mike, some inherited ancient instinct would propel me toward his throat and give me the strength of 10 men. My father was certainly a powerful man. My father, at certain times, was one of the most powerful and frightening men I knew. Up to this moment, all I thought I had inherited from him was his pride and his nose. But maybe once I was standing face to face with Mike Doctor, I would discover that I inherited his blind rage and a lion heart as well. When we got to the park, a short discussion about the rules of the fight took place. First, it was decided that kicking and biting should not be allowed. Then that kicking should be allowed, but not scratching. During this time, I was standing by a stone water fountain, breathing slowly and wondering when the blood of my father and his father's father was going to show itself. I still couldn't summon enough rage or fury or indignation to make me want to fight Mike or anyone else. All I could do was hope that I was subconsciously feeling those things and was merely biding my time. "A fight's a fight," I heard someone say. "No BS rules." This motion was contemplated and then carried. Everything allowed. No BS rules. Should we take our shirts off?" I asked, hoping to postpone things a little longer. "Whatever," someone said. And with that, all the decisions were made, and there was nothing for Mike and me to do but face each other and fight. Tim Hamilton, a referee, walked us to a clearing and told us to shake hands and fight whenever we were ready. For a moment, Mike and I just looked at each other. Then, Mike crouched a little. I do not know why, and began to circle me. I knew I should move in and attack immediately, but I was rooted where I stood. Okay, wow. Did you catch some of those nasty group dynamics? Think. Look at your notes or your jots. What group dynamics did you see? Did you see conflict with the group versus the individual? Did you notice how the 8th grade kids were more vicious together, like a mob mentality, than they probably were alone? Did you hear how Linda was egging on the fight? This group seems to wield tremendous influence. In this case, in this place, it's for bad, not for good. So I wrote down a couple of notes that this group is more vicious together. They have like a mob mentality, and they're a bad influence. Now I'm going to add in some thinking about my individual, the role of the individual, my main character, Will. I'm starting to think of Will as a victim in this group. Seems like everybody's against him. In many stories and in history, the individual can be the victim of a group. But sometimes the individual might be a great leader and a force for good, like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the world, or like Katniss in literature. But other times the individual can be a force for bad. Okay? He or she can be what's called a bad apple, or sometimes a bad seed if the character's truly evil. So I just wanted to tell you, these are just some notes about individuals in general. So you could have a bad apple or a bad seed, or you could have a good leader. A bad seed is truly evil. A bad apple is just kind of like a bad influence. All right, so Will is not a bad seed, but he might be a bad apple. I want to actually go back to an earlier part of the story to kind of talk about why I think he's a bad apple. At the beginning of the story, something that just came to mind. Let me find it. I think it was on page 1. All right, here it is. I'm going to show you, I'm going to read a couple of things. Things probably would have taken a peaceful turn if I hadn't walked home with Kevin Cox after school and told him that the next time Mike and I played basketball, I was really going to throw some elbows, and that if Mike didn't like it, I would fight him anytime, anywhere. Okay, so Will said this. And then a little later, he says, like he's at lunch with his friends. And he's talking and listening in his usual superior way. So I think Will is a bad apple. And he's also like an instigator, I think. Because he describes himself as superior, and then he just acts like he'd fight Mike anytime, anywhere. He's trying to be tough in front of a friend. So he kind of is bringing this on himself, this fight. He could have done different things to change the way that the story went, but he chose to be an instigator. So I think that what we need to do is we need to hold both truths as coexistent. Okay, so the group is influencing this place in a negative way. But Will is also a negative influence. He's also making things happen the way that they are happening. Okay, and which is a fight, which is bad. Okay. So as we finish the story, I would like you to prepare in your jots what force you think is most influential, group versus individual, or do you think both of them are equally, or do you think they're both equally influential? It doesn't look like we're going to see, but if you see a suddenly powerful, good leader, weigh that influence in as well. Sometimes you can see a powerful, good leader in the individual side. We may not see it here, but in your story, you might see that. So I want you to keep that in mind as you're taking notes for your story whenever you go back to read your book. All right, so I'm going to read the rest of the story, and we're going to see what happens in this fight. All right, I'm going to back up just a tad. Then Mike crouched a little, I do not know why, and began to circle me. I knew I should move in and attack immediately, but I was rooted where I stood. Fight! Someone said, and now Mike began to advance and kick karate style. The kicks not only served to display his formidable kicking skills, but were also a super defensive and offensive weapon. In order to get Mike, I'd have to find some way to get around his kicks, and in order to do that, I would have to be someone who knew how to fight. My only choice, therefore, was to look unworried and back up, which is what I did. Mike, however, was advancing steadily, which meant that I could either continue backing up until I reached the bus stop on Santa Monica Boulevard or stand my ground and see what happened. Pride demanded that I choose the latter. Just in time for Mike to kick me on the thigh, I turned sideways to present a thinner target, bent my knees a little, and took a hard kick to the ribs. Then things began to happen very quickly. In an instant, Mike was on me and my legs buckled, and we were wrestling on the ground. In an effort to prove that I could fight as dirty as anyone, I gingerly grabbed his groin and discovered that I had neither the will nor the strength to squeeze. Oh, so that's how you want to play? Mike said, grabbing my groin a good deal less gingerly and wrestling me onto my back. Somehow, I was able to get out from under him, and a great deal of grappling, kicking, scratching, and punching ensued while the crowd yelled for either Mike or me to do something that I could not quite make out. Then I saw blood on my shirt and wondered who was bleeding. Before I could find out, Mike was on top of me and my arms were pinned under his knees, and he was hitting me very hard in the face. Curiously, I hardly felt the punches. All I felt was the dull impact of the blows, and all I heard were the shrieks and hollers of the crowd, along with the thump, thump, thump of fist hitting cheek, ear, chin, forehead, and occasionally mouth. For some reason, I was very relaxed. Perhaps because I sensed that I was only getting what I deserved. After all, I had feasted on my own glory and egotism for 3 years. The check was bound to come. "Kill him!" I heard Linda Lieben cry. "Kill him! So Mike reached back and hit me on the side of the head with the hardest punch he had thrown yet. Give, he said. I shook my head. Okay, he said, reaching back to kill me again. He repeated this 8 or 9 times, and after each punch, he said, give, and I said no, or shook my head, and he reached back again. And then for an instant, I had had enough. For one brief moment, the blood of my father and his father's father welled up within me, and I put my hands under Mike's knees, lifted him in the air, held him there, and threw him off me. The crowd gasped, and for a moment, Mike looked surprised, even scared. I stood up to my full height and the full height of my pride and dignity, but I did not know what to do next. I was no more willing to fight now than I had been before. And the moment passed, and my fury ebbed, and before I knew it, Mike was on top of me, picking up where he had left off. Soon I could not distinguish one punch from another, and my ears burned, and the noises around me seemed to be coming from the other end of the hollow tube. I saw glimpses of faces, but I did not see friends or former friends. All I saw was a crowd, and all I heard was a crowd's noise. I knew it was all over. The love notes, the phone calls, the envy, the adulation, every punch robbed me of another friend, another heart, another follower. From here on out, it would just be me and my TV and my memories of glory. And then, one by one, or 2 by 2, the lights went out in my mind, and Mike's legs were around my stomach, and I couldn't breathe. Give, he said. I shook my head. He squeezed harder. Give? Why not? The last sight in my mind said. All I'm giving him is the fight. So I gave. I gave him the fight, the love notes, the phone calls, the envy, the adulation, and the arrogant hull of who I had been. For a moment, I felt very light, almost weightless. Okay, so I want you to take a moment to jot evidence for the influence of the group dynamics, evidence for the bad apples, evidence for the good leaders. Okay, so I think Linda is definitely a bad apple, so I'm going to put her on the individual side. I mean, she's yelling, "Kill him!" So that's pretty bad. And she's an individual that kind of stuck out. That crowd mentality, that mob mentality that I mentioned earlier, they were more than bystanders. They were a crowd of instigators too. So this crowd is instigators. I mean, they're yelling, cheering on the fight. We definitely saw the power of group dynamics and how they pushed for this fight. In the end, we saw Will lose all of his influence and all of his power, didn't we? So we've come to realize that both group dynamics and powerful individuals can wield influence in a place. Sometimes, too, the group and the individual can be at odds with each other, which creates the extra tension. So I want to see how this plays out in your novels. So while you're reading in a longer novel, you might get several changes in who influences a place. Power might shift from one group to another. I'm also curious how this might play out in your studies of history. So whenever you're studying history, you can pay attention to the same group dynamics versus the individual. You can even pay attention to that in today's current times if you watch the news or read about what's going on in our world now. You can still apply group dynamics versus the individual. Okay. So you might not only see some bad apples, you might see strong leaders as well. Okay. So when you go off to read today, I want you to add this to your repertoire. And we're going to add that. I'm going to show you our anchor chart, and we are going to be adding to consider how a group dynamics or how powerful individuals might influence a place. Okay. So read and add your jots to your reader's notebook in your novel. Don't forget that your choice board 3 is due. So use some of the strategies that we've talked about in these past few sessions to create your product. Happy reading.